In this episode, I speak to Dr. Karuna Ramathan about when a leader's ambition hides as vision and how power is different to influence. We discuss the challenges of large-scale change programs, including the importance of aligning the organization's vision and the need for a collective consensus. We discuss the possibility of a culture shift within organizations and the challenges faced during large-scale change programs. We also highlight the importance of collective will, new skills, and leadership development in navigating complex change initiatives. In this conversation, we discuss the importance of influence in leadership and the difference between power and influence, emphasizing that influence is often underestimated and requires effort to develop, whilst power can be easily taken away. I create clear thinking and decisive leaders who can amplify their influence. Contact me to find out how I can help you or your organisation. And today our guest is Karuna Ramathan. How are you doing?
Absolutely well, Judith. Thanks for having me here.
No, you're welcome. So tell me, what's your favourite book?
Wow. I kind of like my own. I mean, navigating the change at sea. But the point here is there are a couple of really good books that have come out recently. And one of my all-time favorites must be the leadership, I call it a leadership primer by Heifetz and Linsky, coming out of Harvard, Leadership on the Line. I think it's a 2017 book.
Okay. And what do you like about it?
I think the very first chapter draws the leader into a compelling discussion around how ambition in leaders is often masked as vision, and how leaders need to watch that, because it is probably a personal drive to want to get the organization to where they believe it can go to or get to, without regard to whether it's actually going to be able to get there. And then that, for the work that I do in change work, I mean, change and transformation work, is fundamental to consulting.
Okay, so it's making sure that the vision for the organisation isn't just the CEO's vision, it's the actual board vision. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that actually there's a shift from being a personal ambition to a collective, consensus-driven, collaborative arrival at a point where we actually believe the organization can shift and get into a preferred future. And that was really instrumental for me. I mean, that whole first chapter.
Brilliant. Thank you for sharing that. So tell us a bit more about you.
As in what I do for the last it's coming to 7 years. I'm an independent consultant. I lead a small team of like-minded associates, and we specialize in transformation and change consulting. And specifically what we do is we help organizations execute their strategy once they've decided that that's the way they want to go, in order to be able to transform themselves either for growth or for some kind of a new state that they need to get into. And that's been going on for 6.5 years. We've had tremendous, amazing successes with clients in this part of the world, where we actually have had a whole range of techniques and tests being diagnosis being done, and quite successfully, on helping hundreds of leaders and managers in organizations move. I mean, I'm involved in such projects now. My team is. That's the one. But we also, in the last 6 years, particularly last 3 years, with the COVID and many of us cooped up at home, we began to doubt that consulting would actually survive, and we didn't know how long the pandemic was going to last. And so we've gone into putting this on a digital platform and doing software as a service. And we're very excited with the Change Leader platform that's going to go out into the entire region at 3 times cheaper and 3 times more effective. So that's keeping us busy. So that's what I do now. But before that, I was in the leadership. I was in government for 3 years in Singapore as its most senior change consultant. My specialty was in designing and facilitating senior leadership conversations around difficult and tricky issues from within the organization. So there was all that confidentiality. But before that, I was 10 years in the leadership center in the Singapore Armed Forces. That center actually did a bit of groundbreaking work in culture shifting for military that was transforming. And before that, I was 19 years in the Navy, of which 11 years was at sea, and 5 of those 11 years were in command of 2 warships. And that sums it all up, Judith.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you. So how do organizations go around shifting from one culture to another? Is there a particular way of doing that?
It's extremely difficult. I mean, depending on who you ask, and there are, of course, some of these ready models out there. But the culture is real. I mean, the starting point for that is whether or not you accept it. There is culture or some parts or different parts of it in every different part of our organizations. And so cultures extend. I mean, it is there. So the issue now is shift to what? And the shift has to be based on new awareness and sensibilities needed to do new types of work, new skills and abilities that come with that, and new attitudes. Ultimately, new attitudes and beliefs would mark that shift. So culture, for the sake of culture, should not be the focus of a shift. Culture in support of a strategy and execution could probably sit better as the need for a shift. But again, it's long cycle work. In the work that we do, this is incredibly difficult work. We've had a few first-hand experiences with trying to engender that, and nothing short of years or few years of it, which is actually beyond the patient span of most senior leaders, because they want to see this in a year or two. Is this making sense?
Yeah, it is. But I'm just wondering, because I think if you're changing the culture, it's always going to be based on a strategy, isn't it? I mean, if you're changing from recognizing that you've got a toxic culture and you're moving to one that isn't toxic, that in itself um is an implementation of a strategy.
Not all the time. It just might be an intention to shift to a better place. And that's really where some of the problem starts, at least in the work that we do, because people cannot see why this is so important. This is how we've been doing work all this while. And basically, that's really the way things are done around here. I mean, a lot of that is real in organizations, particularly with deeply entrenched and embedded practices and basically the way people behave and the way people think about some things. You find that there are many examples of organizations made up of homogeneous groups of people who actually continue to behave in the old traditional ways. And as far as they are concerned, all that's fine and dandy. But again, you use the word toxicity. It's in leadership language, that's quite a difficult phrase to deal with, because toxicity is sitting at the edge of really bad behavior that creates a lot of trouble for people. And for the large part, that kind of work is actually corrective in nature. I'm not quite so sure it is a culture shift, Judith.
I'm not sure why you say that it's not a culture shift.
Yeah, it just could be corrective at some parts of the organization without it being representative of the entire organization. So rarely
Okay.
do we see an entire organization reeking in those terms. You just find some spectacular cases of leaders and people in units behaving in terrible ways. And those things require corrective action. As to whether that constitutes a culture shift, I'm not quite so sure. And that's what I'm saying, Does it make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I guess so my background is a HRD, and
Ah, right.
I've certainly walked into organizations where the entire culture has been toxic. So that's why I was questioning. So you're
Sure,
right, I
sure.
suppose if you're talking about an organization that has thousands of employees, then it's highly unlikely the entire
Yeah.
organization is toxic. But you can certainly have an organization that has a couple of thousand or a few hundred where it can be completely toxic. So I suppose it's just one of scale, I guess.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so that sounds fine. So what kind of challenges is faced when there is large scale change programs? If you can define what for you, what is a large scale change program? So define it for me, and then let me know what the challenges are.
Yeah, sure. Okay, let's start with typically you'd find 3 to 5% of an organization sits at management at the very top. So here you're looking at C-suite, C minuses, the SVPs, people who hold functional responsibilities and accountabilities to the board or whatever. Okay. So people who are responsible for what they are in charge of, simply put. This group is one group that there's traditionally been a lot of attention on. They constitute strategy. They constitute the ability to, basically, this is the collective ability to come together to decide where to take the organization to. So that's one level of change that typically has to happen. In the start state of our work is always to examine that first. Is there a collective will to want to move the organization forward? Or is it, like I said, in Hyphos's work, is there simply a CEO ambition, masked and vision, and that is where I want everyone to go, which makes things a lot difficult for people at the senior level. They might be collegial, but they may not be collective. So that's one level of intervention. The next level of intervention on change work is a set of skills, new skills, to be able to navigate inherently what is complex. The change projects, actually change and transformation work suffers from 70, 80, 75% risk of failure. But what is also lesser known is change projects are incredibly difficult. They are 75% complex. And this is beyond the repertoire of most people who go to work every day and try to do their best. So it makes people very uncomfortable to have to deal with this. And we believe that a lot of the sense-making ability is lacking in organizations at the levels in which these change projects, often new, on the basically upfront risky, needs to be navigated. And so basically we run a change leader type program which guides them through practice on real work, not case study, but on the change projects, to actually unpack these and kind of set up probes and do all kinds of other things and deal with the data and the information coming out of that, to be able to move that into execution, implementation stage, and into the BAU stage, business as usual stage. So that's the second level. So the first is the collective senior. The second is the change leader layer. And sometimes you have organizations that wish to equip, or they want to invest in their talent pipelines to be able to do this new work. And we deal with that as we get asked to do that. The third is a broader group that actually does not happen in the first beachhead mile or the first mile, but gets into the second or third year. And this is really where you start to realize that your transformation agenda has resulted in new work that's found its way into functions. And when new work finds its way into functions, it hits the manager core, it hits middle managers, it hits project managers, it hits people who do the day-to-day work, and they are obviously feeling a little compressed and stressed with the work coming down at them. So the natural human instinct might be to reject new things that don't make sense. So we try to make managers adaptive team leaders. And again, this has been something that we've done quite so successfully in hundreds of managers in organizations, unpacking for them just a little bit of the complexity associated with new work. So that's stage 3. And when we're all nice and ripe, and this, Judith, is where we get to the culture part, we see people, managers, supervisors as cultural ambassadors of sorts who actually could be a little bit more equipped in leadership skills. Now, the position that I take, and I've taken this for a few years, is that managers are not trained as leaders. Simon Sinek says the same thing. He says managers have never been trained as leaders. But then again, leaders are also generally not trained as leaders. They're just formatted in the ways they've been successfully behaving. And so there is some foundational leadership work in terms of influence skills that we could help managers become more comfortable with. And that should result in positive set, Judith, of positive behaviors for the majority at least, so that they become more conscious and aware of the intent and impact of their behaviors, and they grow self-awareness and they get better at self-control for the large part. Now, of course, there's quite a bit of investment here, so we need to find careful and novel ways and ROI type programs to actually deal with the measurement. So a challenge we have in organizations is, how do you measure the effects of this work, which is a couple of projects that we are stuck in right now. I've said quite a bit. I'll pause here, Judith.
Let's listen to a quick advert.
The Maverick Paradox. Judith Germain is an author, speaker, consultant, mentor and trainer, and the leading authority on Maverick leadership. She is the founder of the Maverick Paradox, which supports organizations to enhance their leadership capabilities and to help business owners develop and grow their businesses. Judith enables individuals, business owners, and organizations to improve their impact and influence. She is also HR Zone's leadership columnist, and her expert opinion has appeared in national, international, and trade press.
Welcome back to the Maverick Paradox. This is the podcast for the pathologically curious. Okay, brilliant. Thank you for sharing that. So you talked about one of the stages is about having adaptive team leaders. How do you make that happen? So if someone's listening, what do they need to do?
Yeah. So basically, you take a manager, and the manager's got his whole list of things to do. He's got objectives to meet. He's got KPIs. He's got all that language, all that management language. Basically, is a single task-focused, results-focused individual. He or she is simply just going to get work done. Now, the way organizations are actually, a lot of organizations have actually been put together in waterfall work group form. It simply means that you take the org chart, and the org chart actually drops down into boxes, and you find who's reporting to whom. And Judith, actually the whole basis of that is a job description. So all of us, many of us go to work basically holding on to what descriptions our jobs require us to do. So basically my job is to do this. This is what I get paid to do. And basically it is my job. Now, the problem with transformation is that is by itself inadequate. Now, how much of stretch would be required of an individual would be largely how the role is perceived. And in constructs of team, roles matter more than jobs. In constructs of work groups, job clarity actually matters. So often, and thankfully, in most cases, roles are expansions of jobs. And that actually starts getting in the way when you're trying to build teams. So adaptive team leader has simply 3 words. Adaptive, as in largely a cognitive affective frame. Team, as in a construct around working with different kinds of people and types, and basically people with different data, knowledge, information, wisdom. And leader, because you are actually going to behave in a way where you'll try your best to be influential. And we deconstruct this and we put it, Judith, when we run these programs, we're actually working with people who do the real work. So there are no case studies here. There's no scenarios. There's none of that, but they actually bring in their cross-functional project where they're working with another peer to actually scrub it down in those workshops. And that has given us quite a high degree of success. I mean, we are anywhere between 60 to 75% success on these projects.
Brilliant. Thank you. So if somebody is listening now and they've got a large-scale change program that they need to initiate and then execute, what are the kind of steps that they need to work themselves through?
I think it is all in the field of sense making, and sense making. If we just look at change project, you have to sense make the work ahead. You have to sense make the people who are actually going to be doing the work. You're going to have to be able to size up the capabilities and capacities that you're going to need. You're going to have to ask whether this is worth doing. For example, in a lot of transformation work, the Holy Grail has to be a game changer. A game changer, by definition, is projects not only with high visibility but high impact. Eventually, the question becomes how might you think that this impact is going to be measured, and what is it going to change for anyone? And so you're going to do a lot of uncomfortable work at the front end that makes people brings a lot of discomfort to the orderly controlling types. And we see this repeatedly in leaders and managers. I use the term circling because you just have to circle around and around this idea before you start bringing it into system. So that's a huge challenge. The most leaders and managers are programmed to just get it going, and they're generally impatient and just want to put out a project plan, and that gets in the way of spending time pausing and just working it up front first before jumping into it. This is a huge challenge for most of us.
Okay, thank you. Before we end our call today, is there anything in particular that you feel that I really should have asked you, in which case please ask yourself and then answer it? Or is there anything that you particularly would like to share with the audience?
I think it's important to note that we are now starting to appreciate. Thanks for the question. We are starting to note that influence is actually quite different from power. And in a lot of the work we do in organizations, when we deal with leaders, they take it to be one and the same, which means I've got power. People are going to do as I tell them to do, and so therefore I'm influential. It's quite different actually when you get into the transformation and change space, where you find that power is probably limiting and influence is potentially explosive. So the more influential you are, the more you can get people to do things that they're generally uncomfortable with. And it's coming as increasingly surprising to us just how much people lack influence skills at work. And it's a very understated capability in the middle core, especially, where you may be limited in your power, but you can certainly seek to grow and expand on your influence skills. So that's what I would have liked to have shared today, and I'm glad I've had an opportunity to do that.
Thank you. I totally agree, actually. I spend a lot of my time mentoring and training and talking about how to amplify your influence and impact. And for those that are interested in knowing how to do that, do go to the web, type in amplifyyourinfluence.scoreapp.com. And after between 5 and 7 minutes of answering some questions, you can get a report that actually really highlights how to improve your influence. Because I totally agree with you, and I've been doing this for quite some time, and like you, doing change work and leadership work, noticing that the key thing tends to be the inability to influence well.
Yeah.
And yeah, I've written about this a lot, and I've got my own model about how you can improve your impact and influence, and that it's key. And I love the way that you say influence is explosive and power can be quite limited, because it just reminds me, just recently, last week, with a group of leaders, I was going through that whole thing about what power is and understanding the truth about power. And then actually, like what you were saying, it was just showing the difference that real leadership, real influence can make. And the point that I made was that if you're a leader and you are relying solely on legitimate power, then you have failed. It's not, you absolutely failed, because when people understand power, they recognize that positional power, all that legitimate power, you only have that because the person you're trying to have power over has given it to you, and they can take them away at any point in time. You don't have to play along, and then there's nothing that you can do to move the person. So you need to use different power bases, and use something that I talk about in my book, the Maverick Paradox, the secret power behind successful leaders. I talk about power and maverick power and the difference of those, and how you can use that to make a big difference. So I'm 100% with you there, Karuna.
Thank you, Judith. It's just amazing how understated it is, isn't it? Yeah,
I mean, I agree with Maxwell when he says leadership is influence, nothing more, nothing less. It's absolutely. I don't know why. I think what it is that people are used to seeing manipulation.
Oh yeah.
And people aren't so used to seeing and recognizing influence because it's a lot softer.
Oh yeah. And it's hidden. It's hidden for a large part. Yeah.
Yeah, it's hidden for the last part. It just happens, and people think it's magic, but it's not magic. It's something that you work on, and everyone can get influence. Everyone can have influence, but it does require work for it to be effortless.
I mean, you look at I say this in my workshops, right? I mean, you made a great point. I mean, imagine our personal relationships. I mean, you must be deluded to think that you have power over a person. Yeah. In the choice relationships, we work at our influencing the person. I mean, and we stay within the ethical and moral boundaries, and so we don't manipulate the person to our own end.
If anybody thinks they have power, they need to get hold of a 2-year-old and then tell them what to do. And then you know that you have no power,
No power.
because that 2-year-old knows that legitimate power is nothing.
Totally. I'm thinking of my kids now. I'm thinking of my wife.
And you look how good they are at influencing. Like it's
Oh,
natural,
totally.
isn't it?
I said this in a workshop the other day. I went back and I said this to my wife. I spoke about you today, and I said you are my single weakness in life. And she said, "What do you mean weakness? Aren't I your strength?" And I said, "No, you're my weakness." I agree to pretty much everything you say.
This actually, it's a lot. Parenting. Good parenting is leadership, isn't it? If you
Totally.
if you think about it, yeah, because you've got that toddler at the age of 2, they're unreasonable, right?
Yeah.
And they understand that they may not have no legitimate power, but they have internal power, they have maverick power, they have the ability to make you do stuff. They can manipulate you, but they figure out fairly quickly that influence works better. And I think as they age, they become more reasonable, don't they?
Oh yes, totally. And then, you've got this test out. Lovely.
And then they have to learn all over again as teenagers and adults on how to influence, because it's conditioned. It's interesting actually, because it becomes, if you're not careful, you can this is just, I'm just externally processing, but you are conditioning out the natural form of influence from a toddler into manipulation. Do you know what I mean? So if you're not careful in how you're raising them, you teach them to manipulate and let go of influence, don't you?
Yes, and that becomes a problem when they get older.
And that's the problem, because that takes a lot more unlearning than it is to be naturally influential.
It's some expensive coaching would probably be on the cards as well.
Well, it's a bit like, out of all the personality traits out there, passive aggressiveness is the hardest to change, because the only one who can change it is the passive aggressive. And they will only change it if something mega happens in their life and they suddenly become self-aware. Because otherwise, I mean, passive aggressiveness is a trauma response that works really well for that passive aggressive.
Yeah.
So they're only going to let go of it if something else traumatizing happens that forces them to rethink. So it's like, and you get your passive aggressive person because you have forced them to keep in their anger for a long period of time through trauma.
Yeah, and so I tell you something. I said this on LinkedIn a couple of days ago. I said, I just don't want to be rude, but you can't change mindset in a one-day workshop. I mean, heaven forbid, that's not going to happen. It's this one-day workshop on mindset. You carry a mindset pretty much with you for years,
Yeah. Well, I think, let me think what I think about that. I agree and I disagree. Right. And I guess, because I'm sitting there being the Mavericks, I'm just playing with this now. I'm thinking, if I went somewhere, could you change my mindset? Depends on what it is, I guess. So I guess if it's something around morals and principles, I think that's a harder change, because they get to identity. That takes more effort. But I think if it's like behavior and opinion, I think a well-designed workshop can go a long way into chipping through that.
Oh yeah, it will open things up. Yeah.
But you have to, because I mean I've seen it, but it's and I've done that, but it has to be very well designed, and it depends on what the compelling reason for change is. Yeah. So like if you're trying to change mindset around something that people have to do at work or they get sacked, for example, not saying immediately, but over time, if you don't develop X skills, you won't be needed. That's a lever. Even if it's not pulled, it's a lever that sits there, isn't it? There's a compelling reason to make a change, so people are more likely to go with it. So I think it depends on what's requiring change. But I do agree with you, like, just all things being equal, no one's going to change something that's core to their identity in one day, unless there's a very good reason to do so, whatever that lever happens to be.
Yeah, totally. I resonate with that totally.
Interesting. Wow. So I think this has been a really good conversation, and thank you for coming on the show.
And thank you for having me. It was quite it was quite intensive. I mean, thank you for those questions.
I hope it wasn't too intensive.
Oh, no, not at all, please.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed you coming on.
Thank you. Thanks, Judith.
And thank you out there for tuning into the Maverick Paradox podcast. I am Judith Germain, your host, and I hope you've enjoyed today's conversation.